Welcome to the show. This is Brandon Wen, and you're listening to the Understanding Consumer Neuroscience podcast, brought to you by the folks at Cloud Army. In this episode, Richard talks to Michael Smith about incorporating consumer insights and brain-based research principles into marketing.
Hi, this is Richard Campbell, and thanks for listening to this ongoing series on understanding consumer neuro research. And today we're talking to Michael Smith, who is a neuroscientist and consumer insights professional with over 3 decades of basic and applied research experience in the human brain and behavioral sciences. And he's an independent consumer insights professional who helps clients incorporate brain-based principles into their marketing strategies and tactics, and he serves as a scientific and business strategy advisor to the market research organization, Cloud Army. You've got a long history here, Michael. Thanks so much for coming to talk to me. And an actual PhD, like you're a professional.
Yeah, great to be with you, Richard. And I like to think of myself as a professional, but some days more so than others.
Yeah, I think that's true of all of us, including the ones that don't have the sort of degrees. How did you was this an intended career? How did you get into this space?
Well, I certainly didn't look to this point in my life, starting out as thinking I would end up here. Uh-huh. On the other hand, my career has been fairly consistent in terms of the types of topics that I've focused on. I originally started out back when I was young as an eager graduate student, trying to understand how the brain creates the mind, essentially.
That's almost philosophical in that sense, right? Like we can go look at Kierkegaard and Nietzsche for that too, but you were doing it from a science perspective, like actually looking at the chemistry involved?
Well, actually looking at the physiology involved, okay, and looking at how systems break down when they get damaged. Mm-hmm. So troubleshooting broken brains effectively. So early on, I focused my efforts on very basic research in 2 different domains. One, looking at the brain substrates of memory formation and retrieval.
So how we remember, how
we learn new things, how that can go wrong with brain damage, mm-hmm, and what are the dynamics of it if you're measuring the physiology of the brain. And then complementary to that is I looked at the brain structures and functions involved with cognitive control. That is your ability to take your diffuse thought patterns and focus them in an effortful fashion on solving some problem or issue that's in front of you and important to you.
All right.
And these 2 things are complementary because sometimes learning new things and trying to remember them is an effortful activity. And sometimes it's a very passive, implicit activity that doesn't require explicit cognitive effort to engage in.
Yeah, okay. And I'm thinking in context there. Of course, I'm in a neighborhood. My daughters are grown, but we have a next door neighbor who has a son who's learning to drive, and it's one of those things we've all done. It's hard. It's like what an interesting mechanism of all the things you need to do at once, the focus you need when you're learning to drive, which then becomes reflex once you've learned.
Or unfortunately, sometimes reflexes that fail to kick in when they need to.
Oh, yeah.
And so it can go badly. Mm-hmm. But, it's kind of interesting. There's really a couple different aspects of learning to drive that end up being important. Mm-hmm. There's the book learning part where you have to understand what are the rules of the road, what do different signs mean, how fast you're allowed to go under certain circumstances, what you have to be aware of when you come to an intersection and whose rights are whose.
Yes.
And that's learning facts that if you then have to take a written driving test, you have to recall those facts. Which differ from essentially the motor control aspects of learning to drive.
Yeah.
Knowing how to speed up and slow down and turn and shift and indicate your blinkers when you need to. That all becomes more like skill learning. It's more like riding a bicycle. And it's not things that are something you consciously recall. It's more a form of motor learning that gradually becomes automated, so that in day-to-day life, those low-level motor functions that are intrinsically part of driving kind of drift below the level of awareness,
right,
and do their thing relatively automatically and very effectively and quickly once you learn.
I've certainly had that experience in the passenger seat with a daughter learning to drive where I'm hitting the brake pedal even though the brake pedal's not there.
Yeah.
But the reflex is there.
And it's something you can't really inhibit, and you don't really want to, because you need that reflex to survive.
No, it's good reflex, actually.
So it's kind of interesting, the tools that we've traditionally been able to study these things with, even before these fancy fMRI brain imaging technology existed, people were still studying these types of issues in terms of their brain bases. When I first kind of came into the field, the two methodologies that one could employ to kind of understand how the brain makes the mind is one or two that go back 100 years, in some cases longer. And they involve looking at what happens when you damage the brain. And on the one hand, that's one tool. And the second tool is how you can measure the electrical activity of the brain and how that changes over time while people are engaged in tasks of one form or another.
Interesting.
And then early on, when I was entering this field, I employed both of those methods at some length on some topics that are related to what we were just talking about. So in terms of brain damage, it's been known for many decades that there are really different modes of learning in the brain that can be dissociated by damage to different parts of the brain.
Right.
So, for example, in people that have a condition known as medial temporal lobe amnesia, through damage to areas in the medial temporal lobe of the brain, they lose the ability to learn new facts and to recall facts from the recent past. And that's essentially a permanent form of brain damage.
So no new recordings.
No new recordings. And your recent recordings, since they're less stabilized in the brain, also get lost.
Interesting. But the old recordings from before the injury
stay there.
Yeah. See, and this almost seems like anecdotal evidence, but clearly it's scientific stuff. Like, we've had people with this set of problems.
Oh, yeah. And it's not as uncommon as you might expect.
Interesting.
And so you can study those people. And while they demonstrably have an inability to remember what they did yesterday,
right?
They might have met you yesterday and have no conscious awareness of it whatsoever. They retain ability to do other types of learning. So, for example, they can still learn some motor skills.
Right.
And they can still develop some habits.
And those will persist.
Those will persist. And they will have no conscious awareness of the learning episodes that allow them to develop some new skills or habits, even though they can display them when you ask them to do a task. So, for example, if you have a simple puzzle and you had one of these patients put together the puzzle pieces to form an image they could see sitting in front of them, they might be able to do that.
Right.
And on one day, you could time them to see how long it took them to do that. And you'll find out, okay, that's their puzzle completion time. Then you bring them in the next day or a week later, the same patient.
Right.
And you ask them, well, do you remember last time you were here? And they would say no. And you could ask them, do you remember that puzzle that you put together before? And they would, no, I've never seen that before.
Right.
And then you ask them, okay, well, that's fine. My mistake. Why don't you try to put this puzzle together and just make the pieces fit the picture that you see?
Right.
And say go, and they can do that because it's a simple puzzle. But if you time them that second time, they're faster at putting it together. But they will have no awareness of having done it before.
Right. And so they don't know they're faster. It's only because you've measured it between it. So there's some part of the memory that's been retained.
Yeah.
Even if it isn't sort of the conscious part of the memory.
Yeah, it's referred to So the conscious part of the memory is referred to as declarative memory.
Okay.
You can declare that you memorized something.
Right.
And that can either be facts about the world or specific personal experiences that you might have had.
Or that you've seen that puzzle before, or that, the yield to the right.
And then the other part of the learning mechanisms is what's called procedural memory.
Mm-hmm.
And procedural memory unfolds outside of your realm of awareness. It's just building those new motor skills and cognitive sequences that allow you to do things more efficiently. So procedural memory underlies the development of habits. Declarative memory underlies the development of factual knowledge about the world. And we've shown through various types of research that those things are dissociated in the normal mind as well.
Wow. So not just folks with this particular issue, but in general, people don't connect these two things together. If I could back up to the whole driving example, I wonder if I would still pass the written driving test, even though I'm perfectly capable with the reflexes of driving. Like the memories around the exact, answers to all of those questions have long since faded, even if the skills to drive the car are there.
Yeah, unless you're recalling them on a frequent basis, some of those arcane facts you'll never encounter again except on that written driving test.
Right.
And as a result, they fade away.
Yeah.
Much like the rest of our lives if we don't rehearse them. And so anyway, that breakdown in the functional capacity of the brain as a result of brain damage was one tool we had to investigate these activities.
Right.
And then another tool back then that we had was looking at the physiology of the brain. People have been doing that for 100 years using electrical measures like the electroencephalogram and related types of measurements.
So these are the little pads you put on the head and
the little sensors you can attach to the head, or you could actually stick electrodes in the head in some circumstances for clinical reasons.
Right.
And measure the electrical activity of the brain and how it changes over time. And you can do this either when someone's just sitting still and relaxing, or you can do it while they're engaged in various artificial tasks that you might create because you want to see how the brain responds to different task conditions.
And so the EEG is able to show differences in brain behavior between sitting placidly and actually actively doing a task.
Hugely. And also differences between what the specific task you're doing versus some type of control condition. So when you're sitting still and you're measuring the activity of the brain and you're just in a relaxed resting state, you see different patterns of activity than you do when you force someone to focus on doing a task, especially a task that's hard. And this comes back to that issue of cognitive control that I was mentioning earlier. When you kick in those cognitive control mechanisms, you focus your attention in a way that changes the EEG dynamics. And effectively, you can discriminate a different functional state in the brain that's actively engaged in a task than a brain that's just sitting back chilling.
Okay.
And that can be useful for studying how people react to challenges in their environment of one form or another. You can also get into the nitty-gritty of that task-activated condition of the brain by looking at the specific variations in the specific types of tasks you have people do. So we can come back to that learning and memory sort of example, where you can see behavioral changes over the time as a function of past experiences. You can also see physiological changes over time as a function of past experience. So, for example, in a very simple situation, imagine that declarative memory system I was telling you about.
That sort of, I'm going to remember this process.
Sure. Well, you can set up a situation where you've trained people on some information recently, facts, and a comparable situation where you have completely new information. Mix that recently presented information up with new information, show all that to people while measuring their brain. You can discriminate the activity of their brain that reflects facts they recently learned versus completely new information. So you can detect that people have formed new memories recently for a specific past experience.
And were these patterns consistent enough between people that you could generalize this, given 10 people all being measured, I can tell which of them are learning this for the first time versus already know something?
Yeah. So these changes are very stable. They're very characteristic of humans in general. And as a result, there are literally hundreds of peer-reviewed articles out in the academic literature reporting on the details of this type of phenomena because it is very reliable. There's another aspect of this that's also related to our conversation about, conscious memory versus skill development.
Mm-hmm.
So you can also, instead of probing people's brains for those brain reactions to new facts versus recently learned information, you can also look at how brain activity changes with skill acquisition. So say you give somebody a simple new video game to do, something they've never encountered before.
Right.
And sit them down and ask them to play this simple video game. Well, at first, the brain mechanisms that reflect the engagement of cognitive control, as I was mentioning earlier, this change in state from the resting state to the effortful state, those changes in the electroencephalogram are very dominant. You can see them very clearly when you're newly playing some video game.
Right.
But if you let the person practice that a lot, and to the point they become much more skilled at it before they've leveled up to the next difficult level,
right,
while they're still on the level they're mastering, some of those cognitive control mechanisms that get engaged can relax. They're not needed anymore because you've mastered the basic requirements of performing the game. And you can see that dynamically in the electroencephalogram. Areas begin to let go of the task engagement, become freed up for other activities.
Oh, wow. And so this is sort of an efficiency of our own mind that as we acquire skill, we free up resources to do more sophisticated things or other things as well.
Yeah. You wouldn't want to say these days you're doing a lot of Zoom calls. When you're first doing them, you can't figure out how to operate the controls and also talk to people. But once you've done it for a year now, everyone becomes optimized in their Zoom behavior.
Yes.
And so you can engage in an intelligent conversation without fiddling with the controls all the time.
Yeah, and you can continue talking even when you are adjusting the controls. You're not umming and ahhing.
Well, I haven't got there yet, but I'm working on it.
I'm thinking of the famous story of the lawyer that had a cat filter on, and the hesitancy in his voice was clearly he was struggling with the tools, so he couldn't talk at the same time. But it's a great example, I think, of what you're describing, too. It's like, while you're struggling with the tools, you don't have the resources left to also carry on the conversation, where if you knew your way around the tools, you could just keep talking while adjusting the settings. So how did you apply this knowledge? I mean, this is you in the lab as a scientist, learning about how the mind works and, working with these peer-reviewed papers and so forth. So this is known sense of knowledge. Did you take it somewhere?
Well, yeah, it's kind of interesting because that path of going from basic research to applied research is what ultimately led me into the realm of consumer neuroscience. So there was these issues related to skill learning and cognitive control and the limits to conscious, effortful cognitive performance are of interest to people who study human system interactions of one form or another. So there's this whole field classically called human factors engineering that evolved largely out of trying to figure out during World War II how to get people to operate military machinery, but evolved for many years after that. And then once everybody had personal computers and internet connections and dealt with these days all sorts of digital devices all over the place, now is referred more to user experience engineering.
But long before the user experience term existed, you had, I think especially in the context of World War II, increasingly sophisticated machines that had to be operated by groups of people under extreme circumstances.
And the cost of errors is high.
Yes.
And, people get stressed out and tired, and that just makes the likelihood of errors higher. And so this field of human factors engineering had existed for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
But the issues became even more acute once everything was screen-based.
Right. Less mechanical controls, more digital controls.
And it's quite easy to overwhelm people's information processing capacity as they have lots of screens that they have to deal with concurrently. And so as things like factory controls, imagine a power plant or something where there's screens all over the places. Or if you were looking yesterday at NASA doing this Mars landing.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing.
There's people everywhere with tons of screens, and they all have to pay a close attention to key information.
Yeah.
Well, NASA and the military ended up finding themselves having to train people to master screen-based interactions, and there was a need to understand what are the limits to capacity.
Sure.
For individuals.
Because I got to think the engineering instinct is if I provide you with more information, you'll be more capable. Like the more you know, the better off you'll be.
Yes. If people had infinite capacity to be capable, that might be true, but people are limited information processors.
Right.
So beginning like in the 80s, but this really kicked up in the 90s, a lot of funding became available worldwide, but in the US, especially through the Department of Defense, all the agencies under the Department of Defense, like the Air Force and the Navy and the Army, they all have research labs associated with them, research components. Same thing with the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, same thing with NASA, and many other organizations. They started funding research focused on what can brain science tell us about the limits of human capability to deal with digital systems of one form or another. And this really took off in the 90s.
We know we can overwhelm them with information.
Yeah.
Now, how can we? Because I guess there's two parts of this: how well they know the system, as well as how quickly the system throws information at them. So that, there's a big difference between learning it and operating it.
Yeah. So the idea is, as we now have all systems are becoming more and more intelligent. The ideal was at that point, well, what does the system need to understand about the human operator in order to customize its performance or, its delivery of information to that human operator in a way that would optimize the human system interaction rather than overwhelming.
Because there is this trope that the human was always the weak link in the chain, too.
Well, but that is because largely of faulty system design.
Right. I think that's a fairer thing. Like the human's always been the same creature, but you give a human a bad system, they're going to have a tough time being effective with it.
And ultimately, there's this move to hand everything over to the control of the system, but then you can end up with like Skynet in the Terminator movies, which no one's happy with either.
Yeah, a whole other set of problems. I don't think we're ever comfortable with the machine made the decision.
Well, certainly not yet, and certainly not back then. I was working in situations where we could take advantage of this flood of funding for studying these things to really set a new level of performance in our ability to make sense out of the brain activity of people engaged in computer-based tasks of one form or another. And some of these may be highly controlled tasks. Some of them may be operating, driving, or flight simulators or things of that nature.
But ultimately, to see what people are capable of comprehending, like, is the goal then to modify the system so that the human can comprehend them better?
Yeah, well, that's the ultimate goal. But I was just interested in understanding the limitations of the human.
Because I think there's all these different pieces to this now. Like, do I make the system better? Do I teach the person better? Like, what's the more effective yield there?
And those are complementary things.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
So one aspect of that research domain actually touched exactly on that sort of topic. When we're trying to train human operators to be better. How do we do that?
Mm-hmm.
What's an optimal training protocol based on both measurement of behavior to improve their behavior, but also measurement of their brain activity to reduce the cognitive stress they're experiencing when doing the task. So it's optimizing that aspect of the training protocol. But there's also optimizing their ability to absorb factual information,
Right.
not just to develop skills, but to learn new facts. So some of the things we were funded to do was to look at how do you optimize people's ability to learn new facts in a variety of settings. But imagine you're interacting with a computer-based tutor, or you're in a classroom setting, or you're watching an instructional video on YouTube. Doesn't really matter.
Right.
What's the brain activity look like associated with that type of learning? And how do you optimize uptake? So in the context of doing some of that research, long before there was this field of consumer neuroscience,
Mm-hmm.
we had a need to look at how people encoded video.
Right. As in like, watch this training video. Now, what did you learn from it?
Yeah.
Okay.
But training videos are kind of unwieldy as a starting point because they can be 30 minutes or something.
Yeah.
And usually they're really boring.
Well, you've seen a few military, training videos. Yeah, they were pretty tedious.
Yeah. So we needed something for research purposes that were shorter,
Right.
that, had a storyline that could be conveyed in a short amount of time, and that were instantiated in a way that we could find examples that were really bad versus examples that were really engaging.
Okay.
Because we wanted to discriminate brain activity associated with engaging video
Mm-hmm.
versus video that failed to get people to focus their attention on. And so what we did was to identify television commercials, 30-second television commercials, that were either really funny or emotionally engaging, as attested to by the fact that they had won awards,
Right.
versus television commercials that we got, back during the broadcast TV days when such a thing existed.
Right.
At 3:00 in the morning, there might be some poorly produced ad by the local used car dealer that would come on in between the reruns of black and white movies from the 50s.
Right.
He's really scraping the bottom of the barrel type of television ads.
But what an interesting idea, though. They're all 30 seconds or, a minute or something. There's lots of them. They've already been measured for their effectiveness. So you have like a really useful set of data to work from to then see how minds react to them.
Yeah, and so we did exactly that. This was not part of our grant proposal. I think it was the Air Force funding this.
See, you left out the part where you're going to use old, bad, used car commercials in testing.
Yeah, but we took advantage of that research program we had in place, did some studies on this, and found, lo and behold, we can discriminate using these objective measures of brain activity between really engaging ads and ads that are not so engaging.
Mm-hmm.
And that part of that discrimination related to the ability of people to subsequently remember the content of those ads.
Right.
And to their subjective impressions of how entertaining those ads were.
I guess the question is if the ad is entertaining, does it lead to a sale more than, there's also this, maybe it's just modern times, like some of those really bad ads are incredibly memorable because they're so bad.
Yeah. So that kind of leads us to the next stage of research on this topic.
Oh.
That's where it gets actually real interesting. So we had this kind of one-off research finding, and there wasn't a consumer neuroscience industry at that point in time.
Right. You're doing this to do Air Force training. So he's like, hey, if we make these training videos like the fun advertising, we'll get better results.
Yeah. And literally, this was probably 25 years ago.
Okay.
So we just sat on that for a while and continued to do other forms of research. And then come after the turn of the millennium, in the early stages of the turn of the millennium, there started to be more and more interest in translating basic cognitive neuroscience work into applied settings.
Okay.
In particular, to the growing problem of optimizing advertising creative and other types of marketing communications, because as the media environment essentially exploded,
Yes.
once we went from conventional TV to all information everywhere being digital,
Yeah.
a lot of money was getting spent on ads, and people were becoming increasingly aware that traditional tools for ad testing left a lot to be desired in terms of what worked, why it worked, and what settings it worked. So there grew in almost organically a demand for new tools. And I think, just to harken back to earlier in this series, you did an interview with my colleague, Tom Noble,
Yes.
talking about some of the demand coming from the creative teams themselves for better assessment tools.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in that maelstrom of creativity that was associated with the evolution of this consumer neuroscience field, there was also an opportunity created for the more entrepreneurial neuroscientists to apply their tools to measuring advertising content in a more strategic fashion. And so I ended up getting recruited to an early stage company to help with the rollout of these technologies in global scale to the commercial world. And part of that effort was to look at exactly what you were asking about earlier. What's the difference between effective ads in terms of changing marketplace behavior and ads that fail to do so? And that's, you would think that would have some simple solution, and everybody's always asking, well, what's the secret sauce you need to add to your ad to make it particularly effective? But we've learned it's not quite that simple.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, you can make an ad more engaging by making it funny or emotionally involving in some way, or just by making it fast-paced.
Yes. Exciting.
You can force the brain to be more engaged if you have lots of screen changes, but not necessarily in an emotionally satisfying way.
Yeah.
You can make an ad that's slow and languid and unfolds, well, as slowly as something can over 30 or 60 seconds and can be very emotionally uplifting, and that can be engaging.
Yes.
But neither of those forms of engagement necessarily lend themselves to increased product sales.
Right. To that call to action.
Yeah. And so there's a bit of art involved with threading the needle between something grabbing your attention or being emotionally engaging or being memorable, and the effectiveness by which that ad also conveys ad content.
Right.
Because you can also often, remember I saw the coolest ad about something on the Super Bowl the other day.
Sure. But I couldn't tell you what the product was or what the company was, what the brand was. None of that.
No. So the key part of developing effective ads is to engage the person so that information actually gets built up in mind.
Right.
But to engage them in a way that you're making the brand more accessible.
Right.
That is, you're highlighting associations between the storyline and whatever latent brand representation that the individual may have in their mind. If you're an existing brand, you want that brand to be easily accessible when people are at the point of purchase. And this accessibility or mental availability has been demonstrated to be a really important factor in terms of market share or in terms of increasing market share for brands. So through advertising, you try to make an association between the brand and the content. And ideally, if it's emotional content, you want to associate positive emotions with the brand.
Sure.
Because when they do retrieve it, you want them to feel motivated to seek it out, not motivated to avoid it.
Yeah, that somehow that fulfills something. And I think about ads that are nostalgic, that, pull on positive memories of ours and then try and effectively associate that brand with those positive memories.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be hugely important for making those associations. And so physiology, compared with sort of implicit behavioral testing, can be really good at helping to craft ad content that is demonstrably engaging in terms of pulling you in and focusing your processing capabilities on interacting with the ad, but that also is designed in a way that gets brand information across in an effective fashion. Doing this effectively often takes working closely both with the advertisers, but with the creative teams involved with developing ad content, because it's not enough to just test an ad after it's in the market. You want to design the ad in the first place so it's going to be effective in the market.
Right. And it sounds like there's a bunch of key elements I want in every ad ultimately to be successful. So it's like get down that checklist that all of those things are in this ad.
Well, at least making sure that it's not missing the most important elements. You don't want to constrain the creative process. On the other hand, you want to constrain it enough so that it's actually delivering value to the marketer. And then once you've done that, there are tools in the marketplace that can discern whether an advertising campaign actually led to increased sales for the advertiser.
Right. But you've already spent the money by the time you're doing that measurement. Ideally, before we spend a lot of that money, we're able to craft the right thing.
Yeah, and then the research has been done to show that there is added value for going to that extra trouble.
Sure.
That you can improve the impact of your ad by using neuroscience-based tools to make them more emotionally engaging, to make sure that you effectively communicated that experience is branded, and that your brand representation has been heightened in its accessibility as a function of being exposed to the ad.
Absolutely. And I'm connecting the dots together here because it makes sense to me that, sometime in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the military had built sufficiently complex technology that they were kind of overwhelming their people and needed to refine those interfaces and understand how the mind worked to be able to allow their people to be effective. And by 2000, normal consumer experience was like that too. It was also overwhelming.
Well, certainly getting to be that way.
Yeah. Well, so many channels on television, the internet explosion, the insane array of products that exists in the average grocery store. Just there's a lot of input coming at the average person. How do you get your product to stand out?
Yeah. And, even if you look at the situation where someone's just chilling on their sofa watching television, well, that used to be the totality of the experience to some extent.
Yes.
But now, like, you have your iPad sitting there and you're also checking your phone messages.
Right. One screen is never enough, Michael. It's at least 3 screens. But I can also see that you were, back in those early days doing this research, you primarily were doing testing, I suspect, on military personnel, like putting those sensors on military personnel to do that testing. That seems very reasonable. That's their job. How do you do this at a consumer level? Like, are you bringing people into the lab and doing that same kind of test?
That's a complicated question, although it sounds simple. Well, actually, much of the basic research is done with like normal research recruits because you want to prove out the technology before you field it in a military setting, which is not only very difficult to do procedurally because of the facts on the ground in the military context. They don't want to distract people with something that's not already proven.
Right.
So while some of that work was done with military personnel, the majority is actually done in a laboratory environment with healthy, normal people who might otherwise fit the spec. But then a lot of consumer research that utilizes these same methodologies has been traditionally lab-based. So for many years, I worked both in startups and for large market research organizations such as the Nielsen Corporation in settings that were all carefully controlled lab-based situations where we would recruit people much like you would recruit people for a focus group where you might bring them into an office, but instead bring them in, strap them up with equipment in a controlled environment, and very carefully show them advertising content or other marketing communications while measuring their brain activity or looking at using eye tracking to see where their eyes were looking, or using measures of their body physiology, such as their heart rate or how sweaty their palms are.
Wow.
Or sitting a camera in front of them and looking at whether they're smiling or frowning as they look at content, stuff like that. And you can do that fairly well in a laboratory situation, but it limits the number of people you can test because it's manually demanding and it's very touchy-feely. It's slow.
And especially if you wanted to run every version of your ad, like, just seems expensive too.
It's relatively expensive.
You know, to build some experimental versions of ads and then put together a set of tests like that, that's not a simple thing to do.
And analyzing the data is really difficult. A lot of data gets pulled off these sensors. It takes a good deal of signal processing expertise to actually make sense out of it. So while there are many people who purvey a capability for doing these things, in fact, it requires a great deal of sophistication to do it well.
Right.
And there are limited numbers of people who have that training and knowledge to do it well. And in the best case scenario, it's a slow, cumbersome thing, even if you've automated most of the processing. So there are limitations, but, in the early days of 2021, the biggest limitation that's been a problem over the last year is the COVID pandemic.
Right.
That bringing people into fixed environments and wiring them up with an operator next to them.
Yeah, spending in extended periods of times in groups inside.
In closed situations, that became a big problem. But fortunately, there are techniques you can use that don't rely as much on these laboratory settings that become more valuable in these situations, and that really unleash them for use in testing larger groups of people who are distributed in space. So, if you have to bring people into a lab, well, that implies a lab somewhere.
Right.
And people are only going to come so far to be in your lab.
Yes, or it only gets more expensive at that point. But
Right.
yeah, if you can do this remotely, then you can take a larger sample size and a bigger diversity in demographics as well.
So, technology exists these days to do lots of things online. Certainly, surveys have been fielded online for a long time.
Sure. I think most people have survey fatigue.
Yeah.
You don't want to answer them anymore.
But we also know that traditional survey research is limited because you can't necessarily get at people's unconscious thoughts.
Right. Well, that was what was so interesting about the EEG side, was just you're seeing the actual activity of the brain, not necessarily what people are saying or think they understand.
And not how they've censored what they're saying, or not how they're trying to respond to social biases of one form or another.
Yeah.
You're actually measuring their brain. But, as it turns out, there are tools that rely more on the speed of people's responses, reaction time measures, rather than their overt declarative statements.
Right.
That can get at their implicit associations to content. And those implicit associations can be very informative, both with respect to how they understand their relationships to brands and to the extent to which, say, an ad they were exposed to strengthened those associations or made that brand more mentally accessible, or that resulted in more warm, fuzzy feelings towards those brands.
Right. Well, and you've given me new language in this conversation too. So now I understand when you're doing those kinds of tests, you're not testing declarative memory, you're testing procedural memory.
Or you're testing aspects of declarative memory that don't rise to conscious awareness.
Okay, interesting.
So you can get at procedural memory, but you can also get associations that might exist in declarative memory that don't necessarily result in overt recall of a past experience.
They're not something that someone's going to say, it's something that someone does.
And you can always add in traditional survey methodology, so you get the best of both worlds. And in the online setting, it's also the case these days, there's webcams everywhere.
Yeah.
And so you can still do things to a cruder level than you can in the laboratory, but you can still do things like track people's eyes as they're looking at a screen,
right,
and see what they look at in a dynamic fashion. You can still measure to the extent to which they're smiling or frowning as you're displaying some content to them. So you can still get some aspects of human behavior that are not just articulated aspects of experience. And that can be very informative for helping to craft effective communications.
For sure.
So, for example, if you're showing an ad on a screen and you have your brand logo on a certain part of the screen, and the whole time people are looking at the ad and all the entertaining things that are going on in it, they never look at the ad logo.
Right.
Well, that's useful.
It's good to know. We certainly had that experience in web design over the years. Like anything on the right side of the screen, everyone seems to be blind to it because that seemed to be the column of ads. And it's almost like folks learned not to put energy there, not to even look there.
Yeah, and that can be a problem, say, in e-commerce, if the buy button is down in the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah.
It can take a while to find it. And similarly, imagine if you're shopping for something in a grocery store and you have a shelf set. There's an array of things on the shelf. Well, if you're a powerful brand, you want to be front and center on the shelf.
Right.
You don't want to be on the bottom level. You don't want to be so high people can't see it on the top.
Yeah.
And since most people are scanning shelves kind of left to right, maybe starting in the center and then scanning left to right, you really don't want to be in the bottom right-hand corner.
Yeah.
Because chances are,
you'll get missed.
Best of situations, that's the last place you look.
Yeah.
And so chances are you've already found something else to substitute. And worst case situation, you never look there.
Right.
But that can also be the case digitally. You don't want your brand to be in that corner. You don't want other things that may be key for the consumer to be in that corner.
Right.
And you can demonstrate that that corner is at risk through eye tracking.
Yeah. And I really appreciate the idea of you build this engaging ad, but those brand messages you want to get across, you've got to make sure those are also captured too, that they're positioned correctly, that they're visible in a way that it gets included in that experience. And
part of that is making sure you have the right messages to begin with. So well before you're actually designing the ad and trying to video it, you can actually test the individual messages. Like, so what are the propositions that you want to convey about your product? And which of those propositions do people actually care about?
Right.
So you can use these same tools to, just show a product proposition to a consumer, have them read it or look at it on the screen. You can have them make a judgment about it, but you can kind of pre-diagnose which product propositions are going to be compelling to the consumer.
So what I hear you describing is the gradual composition of ads, starting with, before you build the whole ad, it's like start with product propositions, test that. Now you spend more money and more energy on propositions that engaged well to build the next stages of that. You can test those as well. So this seems like an iterative process to a better advertising approach.
So there's no sense in filming something until you know you're going to film something that's going to at least get you to your basic benchmarks.
Yeah.
And so employing these tools throughout the creative process can be both cost effective, but can lead itself to much more effective advertising that ends up being much more powerful in terms of shifting marketplace behavior.
It's fascinating stuff. You've got a book coming on the sort of climate change side of this approach to marketing as well. I'm just thinking about, in our whole conversation here, we've gotten about to create more effective ads, less resources consumed, so that this is not just the biggest organizations that could take advantage of this technology, that a lot of organizations could. That just seems really efficient. And in this era where we're trying to reduce our spends, right, reduce our resource consumption to do that, it's very compelling.
Yeah. So I'll just pick up on your mention of the book. Yes, I have been focusing my energy, especially over the pandemic, and putting together a book that takes our learnings from the consumer neuroscience arena and applies them to the problem of sort of green or sustainable marketing.
Right.
Advertisers are becoming more and more aware that they need to make product propositions that aren't going to destroy the world if people are going to continue to buy them.
True.
As it turns out, there's a lot of insights from consumer neuroscience that can apply to this basic marketing problem that people have, that advertisers have. So, for example, traditional green marketing approaches would focus on product benefits that are relatively remote to the consumer, both in space and time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, choose this product because it will result in less ice melting to save the polar bears.
Right.
Or some rainforest will not be destroyed because you've been a good human, which is all nice and make people feel good. But for the most part, people engage in things that provide them with immediate personal benefits.
Right.
And those environmental benefits may be kind of secondary in mind. So what the literature suggests, and for my own devious purposes, I would encourage people to explore this more in the book, is that having sustainability or more environmental proposals being part of your product proposition, but making your immediate product promises to be more personally relevant to consumers in their own day-to-day lives,
right,
in the here and now at a cost they can afford, are ultimately going to be much more effective ways to sell green products. And if any viewers or listeners are interested in, the book will be coming out in the end of 2021. It'll be called something like Inspiring Green Consumer Choices, and it'll come out from the London-based publisher Kogan Page.
Nice. So, and I guess the question is, do we associate ourselves with those green messages because the consumer is already biased that way and you're making a positive brand association, or are we creating those associations in the first place?
Well, it's a bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
So people who are already biased in that way are more likely to be attracted to things with a green aura to it.
Right.
And so they're going to engage more. But the vast majority of people, some are actively uninterested in that dimension of product promise. The majority are vaguely interested, but they're mainly just being able to afford products that they can rely on and that their kids will eat and that, they'll know how to dispose of.
That the green option only becomes relevant when all other things are equal.
Yeah, and so they don't want to be bad environmental citizens. They're not going to go out of their way to only focus on that.
Right.
So existing manufacturers that have large brand leading products, if they want to keep their clientele as people become more concerned about this topic, they're going to switch to having green supply chains and recyclable packaging or whatnot. There's beginning to be more of a societal emphasis on that need, while also conveying their existing product promise of their trusted brand to consumers who are relying on them to fulfill their real day-to-day need. So it's a bit of both, conveying to consumers these green benefits while reinforcing the benefits and the brand trust that they have come to know and love about your product.
Right. Yeah, it's a complicated process too, and different people are in different points in their understanding or concern level around it too. So I guess you have to be careful not to alienate as much as also inform.
Which you can, especially if you convey the possibility that your product is weaker in some respect,
right,
because it's greener. It might not work as well.
Or more expensive.
Or more expensive. It's like if you're asking me to pay twice as much and I've never heard of this product before and I don't trust it in the first place.
Right.
That's a recipe for failure in the market.
Sure, yeah. So your emphasis on existing brands, this is something they can tune to rather than new and upcoming, unless you really are going to market specifically to the pro-green audience.
Which that's what people traditionally have been doing.
Right.
And that's been working, but slowly.
Yeah, you're right. Trying to rise the tide there.
Exactly.
It's fascinating stuff. And it's interesting that we have all those different elements because, we've really, as much focused on consumer neuroscience, we are definitely talking about retail product, but consumer neuroscience applies equally well to the governmental messaging around climate change and the greenification of the economy too.
Sure. And there's actually been quite a bit of work on just that topic.
Mm-hmm.
How do you talk about, the existential issues we're confronting with environmental degradation in terms from a policy perspective, an advocacy perspective from the organizations that are focusing on changes in policy and practices. And there are a lot of people working on exactly that, employing some of the same techniques for improving pro-social messaging in general around these topics.
Yeah, it's hard to make an existential threat consumable, especially a slow-moving one like climate change. Like that's tough doctrine, but obviously important because it is a threat.
Well, and one of the luxuries, if you want to call it that, is there are more and more day-to-day experiences that people are having in the here and now that make the issue much more salient.
Yes.
I live on the West Coast. Last year, our fire season was horrific.
Yeah.
Mind-altering and life-altering. Just like this last week in the U.S. and much of Canada, there was this distortion in the polar vortex that brought all this cold air.
Extreme cold came down. I mean, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico.
Which is another manifestation of climate change that's underappreciated. It's not all things being hot and dry. It can screw up your climate in lots of interesting ways that are a killer when it comes down to it. And this isn't the future. This is the here and now. And so there's a lot of opportunity to make things personally relevant to people now in their own day-to-day lives, rather than talking about these issues in a more abstract fashion.
Sure. And getting it into day-to-day behaviors that will make a difference, which I think just dismantling that away, getting it seen.
Hopefully. Or at least providing support for government policies that can also shift consumer behavior in a more positive direction.
All of those sorts of things. And it's an interesting array of things. And I appreciate that we focus very much on the retail side, and I like that. But it's important to remember this is consumer neuroscience applies to a lot of ways of shifting behavior, not just buying a new product.
Those ways may be more important.
Possibly more important.
Just buying new product.
Dr. Smith, thank you so much for talking to me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure, and good luck with 2021.
Yeah, and same to you too. And we'll talk to you on the next episode of Understanding Consumer Neuroscience.